Hi everybody, you're listening to Comics and History, episode number 131, part 1, Spotlight on the Hal Jordan Spectre. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Brian J. Ragate, and class is back in session as we resume our look at the publishing history of DC's Spirit of Vengeance, the Spectre. And we're getting into a really interesting period of time here because now we're looking at somebody other than Jim Corrigan serving in the role of the Spectre, or rather the host of the Spectre, thanks to that revelation which came out during the John Ostrander Tom Mandrake run, which preceded the Hal Jordan as Spectre era. We're looking at a roughly 5-year period of time, roughly mid-1999 through 2004, 2005, thanks to a couple of delays in the release of later issues of Green Lantern Rebirth. And this is a period of time which, to my mind, is growing increasingly obscure. I think part of it has to do with the fact that we're looking at a period of time that is now 20 years old. As well, Jeff Johns' time on the Green Lantern franchise in the pre-Flashpoint era through the New 52 era left such an indelible mark on the Green Lantern franchise that today a lot of readers, young and old alike, look back and say, Hal Jordan was the Spectre? How did that happen? Or how could I have forgotten that? But yeah, that was a thing. And I'm just thinking that Doomsday Clock at the time of this recording is creeping its way along towards its conclusion, and I'm hearing rumblings that in 2020 there's going to be another line-wide reboot, which a number of DC fans are hoping is actually going to restore a certain amount of pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths material. And having said that, it wouldn't surprise me if, and when we get this line-wide reboot, it's established that Hal Jordan was never the Spectre in this new continuity. In fact, I'll go one step further and I'll say it wouldn't surprise me if it's explained that in the new reality, Hal Jordan was never Parallax to begin with. But we'll see. For now, let's enjoy our look at this 5-year plus change period in which the then former Green Lantern who had gone rogue got a chance to seek redemption by serving as the host for the Divine Wrath. And now, episode number 124 of this show was a marathon recording. I did that because I have such love and admiration for the Ostrander Mandrake run on the Spectre, but as well as I've mentioned before on previous episodes, to the best of my knowledge, there is no dedicated Spectre podcast out there. And so I really wanted to go in depth with that run on the Spectre because so many important things about the Spectre were established by Mr. Ostrander Mandrake. But when it comes to looking at the Hal Jordan Spectre, folks, I think it's safe to say you're not going to get an 8-part episode. My focus here is going to be looking at the genesis of the concept of Hal Jordan as the Spectre. I'm going to be looking at different stories and storylines from the time period, which to me are historically significant. But the really neat thing is that there is a dedicated Hal Jordan as Spectre podcast out there. It's called Green Lantern Pre-Birth, or Lanterncast Presents Pre-Birth. It's from the Lanternologists who really know their Green Lantern lore. If you want a really solid, insightful, in-depth podcast about the Green Lantern franchise, head on over to the Lantern Cast. And what's really neat about Pre-Birth is that co-hosts Mark Marble and Jim Ford are taking a chronological look at every single appearance of Hal Jordan as the Spectre, and they're going full on in depth in their examination of every appearance of Hal as the Spectre. They've clearly put in a lot of work into this show, and so I have respect for them because I don't want to come off as picking off of everything they're saying. My look here at Hal Jordan as the Spectre is going to be a more general overview of the character. So if you want a more in-depth look at Hal as the Spectre, issue by issue, head on over to Lantern Cast for Pre-Birth. And looking forward, I have to say that I'm really looking forward to talking about the Christmas Al and Spectre too. I may get a little more in-depth with my look at that incarnation of the Spectre because, again, I don't think that the Christmas Al Spectre has his own dedicated podcast out there. Okay, so enough of a preamble. Let's get into looking at the question of how such an iconic costume crime fighter as Hal Jordan became the host for the Spirit of Vengeance. And so just a quick recap going back to 1997. Mr. Ostrander and Mandrake brought Jim Corrigan's story as the Spectre to a beautiful end. Throughout that run, Jim Corrigan was going on a spiritual odyssey, a quest to gain greater knowledge about himself, his very soul. And he learned that his mission as a Spectre wasn't simply to confront and punish evil, it was also to comprehend evil so that he could better comprehend the darkness which existed within his own soul. And so in the final issues of the Ostrander Mandrake run, Jim Corrigan finally found it within himself to forgive his abusive father. He also came to terms with God, or at least Jim Corrigan's perception of God, and in so doing, he released so much of the darkness, the anger from his soul, that he was finally able to have a proper funeral service, and he was able to relinquish his duties as the host of the Spectre. And Jim Corrigan, as was visually implied in the 62nd issue, went off to heaven. And the Spectre went off for parts unknown. And my thought is that readers at the time felt, okay, well, the Spectre force is just going back to the gates of heaven. Is going to wait to be reassigned to a new host by God or the presence. So that's what was going on with the Spectre. But now in terms of Hal Jordan, just casting our minds back to the mid-90s, DC's attempt to revive, refresh, revitalize the Green Lantern franchise by introducing Kyle Rayner as a DC analog for Spider-Man and retooling Hal Jordan as a DC analog for Magneto had mixed results. Kyle Rayner as Green Lantern was a very well received concept, especially as Kyle evolved beyond being just a riff on Spider-Man wearing a Green Lantern ring. Kyle Rayner really became a very unique character. And even though he was the last of the Green Lanterns, he was very well received in that role. But when it came to making Hal a Magneto level villain or anti-hero slash villain, it really didn't come off so well. There was hope with Zero Hour that Hal would become this overarching threat within the DC universe, but following Zero Hour, Hal really became more of not a snidely Whiplash character, but Hal as Parallax became a straight up villain who was bent on getting his ring back. And it wasn't really his ring. Kyle's ring was formed from the shards of Hal's broken ring and imbued with some extra Guardian magic by Ganthet. But so many of the return appearances by Parallax, Hal would come oh so close to beating Kyle down and taking his ring, but then Hal would collapse into this blubbering mess, and he would seek forgiveness, and he'd say, "Okay, kid, I'm going to leave you alone, and I won't bother you again," and he'd just run off with his cape between his legs. But he kept on coming back, and so by 1997, with the release of the Final Night event, it was decided that Hal Jordan would have his chance to fly off into the sunset. Pardon the pun, as in the conclusion of Final Night, Hal had his moment of clarity where he was able to put his own grief and guilt and anger aside, and he was able to take all of the energy that he had absorbed from the central power battery, as well as the residual chronal energy from the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, and he spent all of that energy reigniting the sun, and in so doing, he died. And so in the following month's issue of Green Lantern, Hal Jordan got Hero's Funeral. Now, DC's editorial edict, starting off with this issue, was that Hal did have that moment of heroism. However, he was going to be, for all intents and purposes, remembered as somebody who had a downfall and ultimately died as a villain. But that didn't mean that Hal went away. Rather, Hal kept on coming back. There were flashback stories in books such as Legends of the DC Universe, but there were also stories like Green Lantern Emerald Knights, which kicked off with issue number 100 of the third volume of Green Lantern, in which a time-lost rookie Hal Jordan was brought forward to the present time and went on a series of adventures with Kyle, as well as Connor Hawke, who was at that time the one and only Green Arrow. And that story arc culminated with the young Hal Jordan helping Kyle Rayner in taking down an equally time-lost Parallax. And in fact, the biggest joke that circulated around the DC fandom during the period 1997 to 2005 was that Hal Jordan was never really gone. He was always there in some way, shape, or form, whether it be on the printed page or whether just in reference in a line of dialogue. And in a metatextual sense, that really speaks to the dominant character of Hal Jordan. He just has such presence within the fictional DC universe, but even beyond the printed page, where even his death could not keep him from making his presence felt within the DC universe. So by 1999 then, there's a question of what to do with the Spectre and what to do with Hal Jordan. So enter a young writer by the name of Jeff Johns. And he presented, I would say, Given his